Hey, Insatiable listeners. So 2 weeks ago, I was feeling really extra sensitive. I would find myself crying during certain songs and podcasts or certain funny things Essa would say. I was like crying, laughing. And my patience for Essa, who's a very strong-willed 4.5-year-old, seemed to vanish. I didn't have the normal calm that I felt with him. I just felt like I was crawling out of my skin when he wouldn't do what I wanted him to do, which is quite often. And I began to deeply worry about not being around to watch Essa grow up. I know a lot of you listen to We Can Do Hard Things as well with Amanda and Glennon Doyle and Abby Wambach. And if you've listened to that episode, the podcast recently, Amanda has just been diagnosed with breast cancer. And in one of the podcasts, she was talking about her daughter, Alice, who was afraid to run the mile at school. And she went up to the school to watch her run. And she's like, I just want more time to do that. And I just lost it. And I was walking in my neighborhood and just tears flowed. And I was like, what is going on? And then that a couple days later, it hit me that the day that I realized the day that I realized what was going on was May 22nd. And that is the day that I was diagnosed with cancer 32 years ago. It still boggles my mind that I have lived about 70% of my life as a cancer survivor. So to say that I have some perspective, I think is an understatement. And, I talk about the body having wisdom, but sometimes even I forget, right? It's like, of course the body knows. Of course it remembers. And of course I was judging myself for, why are you being so sensitive? Why are you being emotional? Things are okay. And I had to remind myself of my own teachings that I work on with clients of, why does this make sense? Okay. And it made sense because my body's always going to remember. There aren't certain things that we ever get over, but that we can work through. And while I am still firmly not in the camp of everything happens for a reason, I think if we're lucky enough, we get time and we are shown the way how to make a reason from what happened to us. And this is what this podcast episode is about. I recorded it 2 years ago, and I actually feel like it's more relevant than it was 2 years ago. The gist of this is how to become discerning about what you need to do for your health. Because as the years go on, I see what started out as a really well-intentioned wellness movement turn into an industry, right? And that's what capitalism does. And as part of making the wellness movement into an industry, everyone's trying to market something, oversimplify things, and it can be really overwhelming if you're not quite sure what works for you or what is your next step. So I did this podcast 2 years ago to help you understand how my own healing from cancer, right? Curing and being healed are different things. Cured in Western medicine means the disease is no longer present. But healing, in my opinion, is how do you move forward in a way that accompanies so much grief, so much loss, and can you open you up to things that you might not have otherwise been privy to. And so this episode is about how to become more discerning. What is the difference between authoritative and experts? Because we also are in a climate of really not believing experts at all. And that's just too blanket of an all or nothing way of looking at things. That's too black and white. Experts have expertise and they're not authoritative. So I get into the difference of that and how all of us, regardless of where we are in our health journey, really have to learn to expand our definition of health beyond just weight. Now, I'm probably going to do another episode coming up on where weight and health overlap, because I also think that we've lost the plot on that as well. So, but in the meantime, I want you to enjoy this episode. I hope it helps you become more discerning so you're not wasting time or effort or stalling out with your results. So enjoy. And then one more thing. We are trying to get Insatiable to 200 podcast reviews. And when I sent this out to my email list last week, we were at 177, and now we're at 182. So I would love if by the end of summer, we could get 18 more to get to 200. And all you need to do on Apple, iTunes, or Spotify makes it even easier because you just have to click the stars. But if you listen on Apple Tunes, my iTunes, Apple Podcasts, oh my God, I'm showing my age. You can just scroll down to where the show is, leave a review. And you can, if you don't know what to say, you can say what episode you liked or what you love about the show and give it a rating. I'm going to read 2 new ones that have come in, and I just appreciate everyone bringing them in. So this is from Dirk Digler, Dig3er. And they say, Allie's deep expertise and authentic approach shine through every episode, making complex topics about health, food, and self-image accessible and relatable. The podcast offers a refreshing take on holistic wellness, blending practical advice with heartfelt discussions. The combination of expert interviews and her own insightful solo episodes result in actionable strategies. It's a beacon of compassionate guidance in the overcrowded wellness podcast landscape. Thank you. Dirk, it's like spelled kind of funny, but that's hilarious because I think Dirk Diggler was like a 80s movie character. It's escaping me right now. Okay. Lips123 wrote, amazing podcast. This is an incredible podcast. Allie has such an incredible way of breaking down confusing information in a digestible way. Her guests are also incredible. I have learned so much and never miss an episode. Thank you, Allie. You are making this perimenopausal journey way less confusing than it has to be. Yes, we don't need it to be so confusing. And then Ego Baby Mag wrote, super informative and helpful. This has become my go-to podcast for all things health and nutrition. Love it. Thank you so much, all of you who are leaving reviews. I'll read some more later. And in the meantime, enjoy this episode. And I'll see you again on the flip side. So I am 30 years out, y'all, from being diagnosed with cancer. I'm 43, so I've lived about 67% of my life as a cancer survivor. And that is just really wild to me when I take that in, like 30 years, right? It was 1992. Shout out to my Philly friends, the Philly Greats Boys to Men's End of the Road was on the top of the charts. And cancer was much more rare. For children, it was even rarer. So was survivorship. I'm part of a long-term follow-up study for childhood cancer survivors. And the recent newsletter said more children than ever are surviving cancer, and we survivors are living longer. And this is great news. And it's a real testament to Western medicine. And I'm still angry. Not enough people are asking why are more children and adults getting cancer. Prevention will always be a lot easier, as we'll get into today. All that I've had to do and what I've learned to really reclaim my health as a result, not just of cancer, but from dieting as well. For those who are new or don't know, here's a quick recap. When I was 13 years old, I was on my dad's Nordic track. I don't know if anyone remembers what those are. Basically, it's a stationary cross-country skiing machine. And from what I remember, I was trying to lose weight for a middle school dance. And I took my pulse on my neck clavicle, which shows you how much body literacy I had. I didn't even know where to take my pulse. But instead of my pulse, I found a lump. And my dad took me to the doctor immediately. And a few short weeks later, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, which is an immune cancer. And I was diagnosed at stage 2A, which meant no symptoms. 2 meant I needed chemo and radiation. If they had caught it a little bit earlier, I would have only had to do chemo. And now, even at stage 2A today, because science learns and iterates, I wouldn't have needed radiation, but I got radiation. So I had 6 months of chemo and a month of radiation. And by age 14, I was in remission. And I haven't had any relapses since. And what I would later find out in my early 20s is that Western medicine saved my life and destroyed my body. I want to repeat this because the world is very polarized right now and people are having trouble holding the and. Western medicine saved my life and destroyed my body. I don't believe my cancer would have been effectively treated with natural medicine. And those life-saving medications destroyed my body. In my early 20s, I was struggling with stubborn acne that I had tried to resolve with antibiotics and Accutane, which makes me shiver with horror right now, but you know what you know. And it obviously all came back. Irritable bowel syndrome, I was diagnosed with, depression, and worsening out of control eating. And I continued to battle my weight. I had actually been battling my weight before cancer, having gone to Weight Watchers at age 11. And cancer was likely the only sabbatical I ever took on trying to lose weight, meaning I wasn't trying to lose weight when I had cancer. And that was kind of the only time I wasn't really conscious of my weight. I was also losing a lot of weight from the chemo. As a result of diets, cancer, and my subsequent health issues, I had a deeply entrenched story that my body was a disappointment. And I had tons of proof. As we'll discuss today, our body stories don't come out of nowhere. And yet, as Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, author of Women Who Run with the Wolves, says, the doors to the world of the wild self are few but precious. If you have a deep scar, that is a door. If you have an old story, that is a door. If you love the sky and the water so much, you almost cannot bear it, that is a door. If you yearn for a deeper life, a full life, a sane life, that is a door. So my body story became an invitation into the wild self, which I now see as being a healthy rebel. With wild being alive and present to what is true for ourselves and the changing nature of what life is asking of us. In other words, who is life asking us to become? And I think a lot of us are asking that question right now as a result of the past couple of years. And the way I changed my story was, yes, to get out of diet culture. But I don't think it's enough to be anti-diet. We have to know what we are working towards. I want you to work towards more than just body tolerance. And this is what my Truce coaching framework is about. Taking our body discomfort story and making it a door to the wild self. Yes, to leaving diet culture behind and deeply understanding the power we have when we learn how to hear what our body is saying and asking of us. Being our wild self is often referred to as authenticity today. And I take this one step further so that you feel powerful enough to feel comfortable in your body by creating a life on your own authentic terms. So to me, your wild self is authenticity and courage. And our food falls into place the more you grow into your wild self. Today, I'll be peeling back the curtain a bit further into how to plot twist your body story, using my cancer experience to illustrate some of what goes into changing our body story, which will change your eating habits, especially the stubborn ones. I'll emphasize the values gap I addressed in my email to my list that resonated so much for so many of you. Because body discomfort and subsequent unhealthy body stories emerge when we have a values gap. And this values gap matters deeply right now. So today you will see how I evolved my value of health from one of health equals being thin to one of a more true definition of health. And that radically evolved my body story. If you're struggling with body discomfort, eating out of alignment with your goals, and chronic health issues like depression, anxiety, Hashimoto's, or fertility and reproductive health, this episode is especially for you. While you may not have had cancer like me, we are in different boats in the same river. And that river is one of insufficient research, understanding, or a clear, integrative, and holistic map to guide what will work to relieve your body discomfort. I am part of the first generation of childhood cancer survivors. Us being physically alive is a new frontier. And while this is great news and something I will never take for granted, The long-term follow-up study I mentioned above just noted in its most recent newsletter that 3/4 of childhood cancer survivors develop at least one chronic health condition in the decades after their treatment. And this was definitely my story. And I didn't find many useful answers for depression, IBS, or disordered eating, especially because at the time, I hadn't connected that to my cancer treatments. This was in part because there was no research. And yet, if you are a woman with any sort of health issues, you need to realize there's not enough research for you either. There's research in pockets, but part of your own heroine's journey will be to endlessly advocate for yourself and learn to trust in your own body's feedback. Also, our medical system isn't designed for wellness. Doctors are trained in disease management. Wellness, at its best, asks very different questions, like what are the root causes of depression or our out of control eating? As a result of there basically being no wellness frontier 20 years ago, both for cancer survivors and the rest of you, I had to forge my own path in defining health, and you will too. I wish this weren't the case, and we can be part of the change our culture needs by learning to advocate for ourselves and create the frontier to make it easier for others behind us. This episode is about how I forged my own path, which began 20 years ago in a very different environment and world. Dieting wasn't politically incorrect yet. There was no health at every size community, no social media. Functional medicine was super fringe. I hope what you take away from today's episode is that the key wasn't what I ate or what I did, because my path is unique to me and yours will be for you. Rather, it's how I made those decisions and how I evolved my idea of health that ultimately grew me into the health rebel I am today. Specifically, it was to trust that my body's feedback was valuable, perhaps invaluable, especially when what worked was the opposite of what I was told was healthy. This means I had to trust that I could feel good in my body, that I could trust in satisfaction, not sacrificing, which diet culture and patriarchy both encourage in women especially. And I hope anyone listening to this who feels like there is still more to your body story, more healing, satisfaction, and freedom, that you will listen and believe in your wild self to courageously and authentically advocate for yourself more than before this episode. All right, let's do this. So today I'm going to discuss some points I don't think most people know to ask and listener questions. So we need to start with some background, especially on the difference between authority and experts. It is essential to understand how authority and expertise is different if you want to change your food habits and evolve your body story. To put it in story terms, you are the protagonist or leading character in your body story. The experts are magical supporting characters at best, villains at worst. This is a developmental milestone that requires really, really, really understanding there isn't someone who is all-knowing. And if there isn't someone who is all-knowing, there isn't one answer. We just wrapped up Truce with Food, and a client shared how one of her key takeaways was she was just so much more compassionate towards herself because she now understands her food habits and being healthy are so much more nuanced and deep than she was led to believe. So to define authority, I'm going to use my own definition that I think is helpful to really begin to embrace this difference. I think of authority as this idea that someone else or some force outside of us knows exactly what we should do. I joke with my clients that ancient Greeks looked to the god and goddesses for all-knowing authority. Then with the Christian Crusades came the church, and people looked up to priests as the authority. Then it was doctors and celebrities, including celebrity doctors. And now we've replaced them with Instagram influencers. Have we fallen this far? Or are we at rock bottom and can go up from here? Time will tell. I think we've all experienced there's always a new level of abasement these past couple of years. Basically, for the last several thousand years culturally, maybe with the advent of patriarchal religions, we've been increasingly told to trust someone outside of our bodies and not our bodies themselves, right? There's a God outside of our bodies, not within. I'm not going to get into that rabbit hole. Experts, on the other hand, have certain knowledge. I think of experts as having an opinion based on how they see the body in this case. And we often confuse experts as authorities. As a result, whether you are reading a diet book or going to a functional medicine expert, you might think this is the solution. And I wrote that in all caps. Hopefully, this is the protocol, again, all caps, that works. For example, one of my clients was told to go on a low FODMAP diet for her reflux and stomach issues. She printed out 7 different low FODMAP diets from various experts. And she discovered there's 7 different low FODMAP diets. Not one answer, but 7 opinions. I'm going to give you a more in-depth current Truce with Food client example to illustrate why knowing the difference between expert versus authority is like pushing a snowball down the hill and gives you cumulative results. My client, Margaret, gave me permission to share this. She shared, prior to Truce with Food, I had hired and thought I was getting a top nutritionist who has celebrity clients who would help me buy my way out of health issues and get all of my, quote, perfect answers. She is knowledgeable, leans heavily towards vegetarian and vegan lifestyles, and no doubt knows a lot about nutrition and oncology. The only issue is it's a one-size-fits-all sort of plan. When I had asked about meat, already suspecting my body needs it more than the little she had recommended, she had said there isn't any definitive research on it. Meanwhile, my instincts questioned this, but figured the expert would know. So you can see Margaret was previously viewing an expert with a well-informed oncology nutritionist opinion as an authority. And let me note, Margaret doesn't have cancer, right? So then after working with a naturopath during Truce with Food, she discovered red meat a few times a week has profoundly eliminated much of her endometriosis, bleeding and pain, and anemia. Her body is providing outstanding, great research on what works for her, even if the scientific literature hasn't caught up. Because let me tell you, how much research do you think there is on endometriosis, right? So many doctors gaslight women and tell them it's all in their head. So now Margaret is growing in her ability to self-advocate. Our ability to self-advocate is in direct proportion to how much we trust our bodies. Her snowball is picking up speed. She shared with our group, I am learning to advocate for myself and realizing I need to have the final opinion. One example is I sensed the water filter recommendation my naturopath gave me wasn't what was best for me. I did my own research and realized I need a different one for my health goals. And I love this example because it illustrates it's not about Western or natural medicine, with which naturopaths are incredible with natural medicine. It's about experts versus the authority. I've had so many clients discover that what they learned from both quote unquote sides doesn't actually work for them. It's about the right tool at the right time and no one expert having all of the pieces to your puzzle. In my own body story, learning to challenge the idea that I should be vegetarian as a cancer survivor was what began to loosen my body as a disappointment story. Because at the time, I believed there is one diet for everyone. Remember, this was 20 years ago, right? Times are very different. It's so hard to even explain how different times are. If you're under 30, maybe even 35. And the popular thinking, which I think is actually still true today, is that cancer survivors should be vegetarian, vegan, and low fat. So I was a good girl and religiously trying to follow that. And my hunger, cravings, and depression got worse. But I thought trying to override my hunger and cravings were good things to do because sacrificing equals reward in patriarchal religions, which is diet culture is just a nesting doll of patriarchy. In reality, both are signs that you aren't eating the right foods for you and your metabolism is haywire. I had heard about blood sugar through Dr. Barry Sears, who wrote The Zone Diet, because while I'd love to tell you that I was looking for solutions to my health problems, I was focused on losing weight. I had been socialized to believe that being healthy was about being thin. So I mostly read diet books with the health slant because I wanted to lose weight in a healthy way. I was going to be extra good and hoard all the gold stars, right? I had to be extra, extra. While I learned from the Zone was a great start in emphasizing blood sugar. Yet what the Zone diet got wrong for me is that not everyone balances their blood sugar with the Zone diet or all the processed foods that go along with it. And this is another great example of expert versus authority. Through a lot of experimentation, I discovered I needed a more paleo diet. With this paleo diet, my hunger became easy to satisfy. My cravings disappeared. My moods were more consistent. My obsessively mean thoughts about myself lessened. I now know that was anxiety, but anxiety was rarely a word used 20 years ago. It was dramatically easier to be in my body every day. And wouldn't you know it, the more I learned how my body actually worked, the less of a disappointment my body became. And because I was feeling better, not sacrificing and suffering, it was easier to be consistent with these changes. And this consistency with the right foods for my body led to my skin clearing up, my IBS reversing, and my depression being so much better. At the time, I thought I had reversed my depression, but I didn't realize my moods would get even better. This is when I began to get out of the matrix where, quote, normal is crazy. As I had the common sense realization that wasn't so common to me at the time, that if I felt better and healthier today, I'd have the best chance of being healthier tomorrow and into the future. But I had to trust that my body and its feedback of feeling good was important. And this was how I got out of the insanity of, I know sugar feeds on cancer, yet would binge on it during scanxiety season. And if you struggle with health issues that are exacerbated by eating things you know you shouldn't, this hopefully helps you too. It's counterintuitive, but I had to stop putting pressure on my food choices to prevent or cause cancer. Instead, I had to do it because it helped me feel better immediately. So for example, I had to connect how sugar made scanxiety season harder for me in the present, not making eliminating sugar about some future potential health state. And if you aren't familiar with scanxiety season, this is when, as a cancer survivor or patient, you get tests to see if you are still cancer-free. And what I did originally to, quote, motivate myself was to focus on the research. A high sugar diet creates conditions for cancer to be more likely. I'm sure someone would love to challenge me on that. Go ahead. I'm not messing with it for my short or long-term health. I do eat sugar. I don't think purity is healthy or easier, but I do eat a very low sugar diet. So now I had this sense of agency with my health that I previously didn't have. I didn't understand why I would do what I didn't want to do during scanxiety season when I felt so much better off the sauce. And to me, the sauce was sugar. In my case, I was past the 5 years of being cured when my eating was at its peak of being out of control. So for me, my scans were about being monitored for thyroid and breast cancer because of an increased risk from the radiation to my chest. And of course, there's always a chance your original cancer will come back, but that's not the main focus after 5 years out. It's the secondary cancers that might be caused by your treatments. Really fun, right? And because our healthcare system isn't designed around patients, there is usually a long lag time between scheduling your scans and getting your results. I mean, it used to be, I would say, like a month, and that was conservative. It might change today. I don't know. And what I would notice is there was an increase in how much sugar I ate as the tests actually got closer, and even more while waiting for the results. And then I would go celebrate with something sugary afterwards because, of course, I deserved it for having to deal with all this. I had understood at this point that food could be medicine, but I was thinking only in physical terms like hunger, cravings, and stable moods. Yet once I could connect how sugar reduced my emotional resilience during scanxiety season, reducing it was easier because I was like, why am I going to make this harder for myself when it's already super hard? Because I noticed I had less anxiety and catastrophizing the less sugar I ate. I was also better able to sleep during this period without the sugar, which also increased my resilience. So again, I was having to look at food beyond, oh, all this sugar is going to make me gain weight, or all this sugar is going to make me have cancer, right? These more longer term things. I had to shelve those to actually change my behavior. And during this period, because I knew the foundational that would work for me, now having anxious racing thoughts were now a symptom or out of the ordinary, not chronic. And that's just how I thought I was wired. So this contrast made a profound difference. So the healthier we get, the more we want to stay healthy. And the more when we go off track, we feel it very differently. It feels harder than when we're always in it, always eating all over the place. In Truce with Food, we call connecting how we eat to feeling better the quick fixes, meaning how do the right foods for you quickly make your life easier? Because adults aren't motivated by long-term changes. We have too many other things competing for our attention. So we need immediate improvement to understand the value and actually prioritize new ways of being or new habits, as people often think about them. And note, I didn't have to completely eliminate sugar or be perfect, which was way too much of a stretch at the time for me to still get results. We just had a Truce with Food call where a handful of clients, again, in their reflection of all that they've accomplished, they're amazed at the results that they're getting doing small changes as they connect their food changes to their own individual quick fixes versus not being all or nothing. For example, reducing dairy, not eliminating it, right? It's like, oh my God. And the cool thing is the more you can self-advocate with your body, including its emotional needs, the more you find these unexpected quick fixes because they are so personal and yet to be discovered. For example, one Truce with Food client was sharing, it's weird, but Truce with Food has made me less afraid of dying because she is living more and not waiting on some perfect weight or time, right? So it's like, oh my God, I want to keep taking risks because death doesn't seem so scary, especially if that's something that really is central to you. This was a central question to me, obviously, having had cancer. And I was really curious about death even before all of this. But I shared with her, I have the same experience. I'm just not as afraid of it. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to die anytime soon, but not waiting on my weight has drastically changed how I relate to dying. So if you're struggling with a chronic health challenge or pain, I highly recommend you figure out what your quick fixes are for today and drop the pressure of food totally resolving or reversing your condition completely. Instead, focus on improving symptoms or pain, perhaps 10 to 20%, right? For me, it was my IBS, my moods, my anxiety. For Margaret, right, it was her endometriosis, pain, and energy. Everyone will have their own. And that will give you more energy to do the next step. And in the process, discover how things outside of food matter a lot too. Because once that boulder is going down the hill, you can't stop, won't stop for self-advocating. Some quick fixes to connect your food choices that the recent Truce with Food clients realized were their own, just to give you some ideas, were more energy, more clear thinking. Someone said happy just because, less pain, more restful sleep, more satisfaction from food, and increased sex drive. Now, I do want to mention emotional safety here because that was a big piece of this. Food is important and emotional health matters deeply. So, for example, in my anxiety season, how I stopped using sugar was, yes, to connect it to my emotional resilience. But I also realized I needed someone at the oncology appointments. That really changed a lot of things for me. What a difference. I was living in Philly at the time and my sister was there and so was Carlos. So sometimes Carlos would come, sometimes my sister would come, sometimes they would both come. But I stopped trying to do everything alone. Having them there with me and my parents, well, my parents weren't there, but I would share with my parents about how scared I was rather than trying to be the strong one. It released so much emotion. Physically and emotionally, my nervous system felt held. So that was really key. It took so much pressure off the food because I realized food wasn't the only contributing factor to having a resilient anxiety season. And the less pressure we put on something, often the better we do. So if you're anyone with a chronic illness, so important to have a community that gets it and providers who see you and are willing to work with your self-advocacy. In other words, they're willing to be curious with you and go down the rabbit holes that you want to go down. So as my eating became more aligned with my goals and I had more surprising health results, I lost 15 pounds as a side effect of focusing on feeling physically better. I was shook. At this time, I didn't even have this vision that I could be this healthy or lose weight as a side effect of what I now know is sending enough safety signals to my body, both in terms of food and emotional health during really stressful periods. How did I know about this, but not one doctor I had seen over the last several years didn't? Or my therapist didn't know how food could reduce my obsessive thoughts? Now I feel like a badass, yet humble rebel, because we have to be deep bow to the great mystery, because we'll never fully know why something happens or gets resolved. But at the time, I was like, no one is in charge at the wheel. In other words, this facade of an authority I could trust in had its first massive crack. And this first crack is often the most startling. It's destabilizing and can be liberating if you have someone to support you who is on the body self-advocacy path too. A Truce with Food client who cannot believe how much she's changed and I were talking about how liberating it is to become the authority with our body and stories. And again, authority doesn't mean all knowing in this case, but to use a capitalistic term, we feel like the CEO, like we're the ones in charge who makes the final decisions. So we were talking about how liberating this is. And I'm like, I never told you what to do once. And she's like, you didn't. And we just both started laughing because it's really serious because she has an increasing confidence in herself and her body's wisdom, not me. And that has made all the difference in continuing to put that snowball, right, or that boulder, continuing it to go down the hill. Remember, you are the star, the leading character of your story. And while these days, at least with the people I hang with, it's common to question Western medicine, the personal development industry is cut from the same ideological influences. And what was curious to me was that myself and my clients often get results we don't really even think are possible, especially in the beginning. So I didn't go into changing my food to try to reverse my depression or IBS or skin issues. I was trying to lose weight. Yet it was these unexpected developments that weren't even goals I knew to have that created that boulder going down the hill, which feels like natural motivation. And ironically, not being as focused on weight loss or setting that as my goal, which is what I had done for 18 years, is what actually enabled me to lose weight. So this also made me question the idea of how we set goals and ultimately how we sustainably change. What was more deeply happening that enabled these kinds of transformational results? What was happening developmentally, but I didn't have the language for, was I began to value how important it is to be healthy outside of what you weigh. My value of health was expanding as a result, which brings me to my next point that is essential to how we set food and body goals to evolve our body story. And that's how mainstream coaching goals predicated on, you are not your story, often implying you are not your past, day one begins today, sabotages us and what we need to do instead. What I wouldn't be able to name until I went to grad school, but what's happening was my relationship with my body was changing because my value of health was changing. I went from battling it in a highly dysfunctional relationship to one of mutual respect. And how I was setting weight loss goals in the form of SMART goals or just looking for a better plan or formula was actually sabotaging me. There's many reasons for this, but a major reason was SMART goals and plans reinforced the success and failure judgments I already had of myself. This added shame and deepened my body equals a disappointment story. So again, the results of trying to approach it like this, even though it was the wrong approach, deepened the groove of my story. And so much of the health, fitness, and personal development, there is this push to leave your past behind and quote, rise above. And so we gear up with the same goal, different expert, although we often think they're authoritative. It's the same thing we believe when we say diet starts tomorrow. We are pretending we don't have to address the existing relationship we have with food or our body, which is predicated on a very real past. And as the Eastern philosophy quote says, what you resist persists, what you embrace dissolves. And so what I found is we have to learn to relate to our body differently to evolve our body story. This means we have to listen to our current symptoms and not just ignore them. And I had done that with my physical symptoms to great relief. And so I extended this, I guess, philosophy, understanding to understand that bad habits are like bad symptoms. They're messengers, not inherently bad. Therefore, we can't just try to hack or break bad habits because they are actually protective. And as a result, we think we need all these tools just to do what we know we should. We use all these tools to try to break habits, understanding that they are going to be there until we find a way to protect ourselves in a different form. So I found it's better to ask, why do I need so many tools to manage my emotions? And why is my capacity and resilience diminished? Because that will lead us to a very real past we have to address and heal. For example, EFT, emotional freedom technique, is really popular. And I think it's become really popular for emotional eating and weight loss too. And I'm not here to assess its pros and cons. But to me, the question is, why do I have to tap so much? And to me, what elegantly answers this question, and what I wish I had known before I ever tried to diet, was that safety is the root cause of my binging and weight loss obsession that cancer exasperated, but wasn't the root cause. I would have saved myself so much time, money, poor health, and shame, and lost fulfillment. When you understand food is safety, you understand your self-sabotaging or bad habits around your food, exercise, and health are actually self-protection. And they are often protecting you from the enormous feelings, often shame is in the mix, that our stories generate. So not only do you address the root cause, so you need less, not more tools, but also this orientation requires relating to yourself in a trusting, respectful way, rather than thinking you have to fight yourself. We're going to do a little thought feeling experiment here right now on the podcast. So I want you to think about how you feel about yourself when you think your bad habits need to be fixed, or you need to break them, or find a better way to hack the habits that are really frustrating you. How does that make you feel about yourself? Now, what if you knew your bad eating and health habits, including not using all the tools you've ever learned to make yourself feel better or manage your emotions, make complete sense? What if you discovered your bad eating habits made complete sense? How does that shift how you feel about yourself? Usually we go from one of gearing up in the first question, which is a way of saying battle ourselves, to one of relief and curiosity. Rather than thinking we need to battle ourselves, it's a trusting that we are doing the best we can based on our past. Given my sense of there being an all-knowing authority around our food choices was shattered, I began to question the universally accepted values of willpower, discipline, and the overly male influence theories of coaching being necessary for change. And what I discovered is when our body's story or other stories we have about how to be a good girl or good boy and our lives are active, we turn to food for emotional safety to feel like it will all be okay. Or our stories also prevent us from having the time and energy to take care of ourselves. I shared in my values gap email that my story around needing to be exceptional meant overworking was now my last remaining vice, as food is no longer an issue for me. And this at the time that being super busy and productive was deeply aligned with what life was asking from me. But again, my exceptional story had me valuing being super busy and productive. And again, it's more in the email, alishapiro.com/values gap. So the best way to think of emotional safety is to imagine that felt sense of your favorite cozy sweatshirt that you put on when you come home, you take your bra off and relax. That's the felt sense of what food gives us. It's like an exhale. And if we don't eat, that's also the felt sense of safety we feel familiar with, an absence of okayness. Because some of my clients have struggled with actually eating regularly. And I want to note, because while I'm sharing only about my cancer story, so many other experiences, like failing at dieting especially, influenced my body story. Dieting perhaps did more damage because with cancer, I also felt my body was incredibly strong to survive that. Whereas dieting, it was just failure, and shame. And we talk about in Truce with Food, the death by 1,000 paper cuts, how it's actually these little small things that are continuous that create our stories that influence us actually more sometimes than a narrative. They call it inciting incidents, like in my case, cancer. Because there was also a story that came from being bullied in 5th grade that had nothing to do about food or my body originally. This experience is what turned me into an emotional eater and created a story about myself being an outsider. And so I turned to food to have that sweatshirt feeling of it's all going to be okay, because it wasn't for a really long time. And so I would eventually realize anytime I felt bad or different in a bad way, I would eat, right? I had no idea being bullied was still affecting me. I was like, I was over that. Who wants to be normal, But it was really deeply affecting me in many ways. Many of my clients feel like outsiders too, sometimes from bullying or being othered in some way, included but not limited to their bodies and what they look like. Or they are creative, sensitive, and they sense normal is what is actually crazy. This makes us highly rebel prone. And note to my kindred outsiders and rebels, the normies need your medicine right now. Okay. This is why normal is collapsing. So if we apply this to story work, some of my clients have a story. I have to be on to belong. In other words, they can't be that wild self. On is code for gearing up to belong, right? I got to battle to belong. So then they think they have social anxiety because in the past, they were truly othered in groups or social situations. And they hate small talk, which seems to be the normal thing to do. And this othering, they didn't make this up. And so their social nervous system is on alert, generating this anxiety. We often think it's just about our weight and what that means about us, but it's about a lot of other stuff. The weight is like one piece to this. This social anxiety and eating to cope with it is protective. The social anxiety is trying to secure their belonging. And the eating is the metaphorical attempt at being comforted or grounded because the social anxiety has them in their heads, monitoring what they think other people are thinking about them. And here's where this is different from cognitive behavioral therapy / coaching. Cognitive behavioral coaching is based on cognitive behavioral therapy. In the Truce coaching, we know you can trust your thoughts and feelings because they are coming from a real lived experience. We don't need to try and reframe them. Instead, to work through our stories, we need to tune into ourselves, our bodies, and hear what our needs and wants are in the present, not the past, what those needs were, which we were doing the best we could in the past, right? And when we satisfy those needs, so we belong to ourselves first and foremost, our big story feelings diminish. And then we don't need all the tools for our emotions. So for example, becoming self-authoring, which I'll talk about more in my story, has made me comfortable being different now with groups of women, right? Whereas before, it was really protective for me just to stay small and try not to say anything and try not to be noticed. And now I'm really comfortable standing out, right? And there's so much healing when we can choose differently today when we weren't able to choose a certain way in the past. And so when we focus on improving this relationship to ourselves and what we really wanted to do or wish we could have done way back in the day, but we can do it now, we build self-trust in our capacity to choose differently in the present, when again, often we couldn't in the past, which is incredibly healing. This increased capacity and discernment on what your body is telling you is that boulder continuing down the hill versus hitting a plateau. Because I want to be clear, it's not like this is smooth sailing. Like once the boulder goes down the hill, it just doesn't stop. Nope, there will be different, whoop, this is one, but you'll have the momentum and the trust versus thinking all of a sudden you got to go uphill. Our belief is our ability to be ourselves and create a life from that place builds. And over time, this enables us to live into a new self-authored body story. So an important practice to get into when you are engaging in bad habits, ask yourself, what's at risk if I do what I know I should? Trust your bad habits make sense and remain curious. And sometimes the answer comes to you a little bit later than you want. So ask the question and the answers will come. Although I should say story work can be really challenging, especially in the beginning. So don't beat yourself up, but just start with what makes yourself at risk. One listener who's a former client asked me how was being self-authoring was integral in overcoming post-cancer issues later in life. And I'll answer that question here because it illustrates what I mean by self-authoring our body stories. For those unfamiliar with my Truce coaching or developmental psychology, which is the evidence-based change science that the Truce coaching is rooted in, self-authoring is a developmental ability to self-author our story and in effect, self-author our values. But it starts with self-authoring our values and then we live into a new story. For example, I grew up in a family that actually valued health. My mom grew up on what was called an organic farm. It wasn't called an organic farm in the 50s, but it was an organic farm. And my dad was a health and phys ed teacher. And so I especially valued health. So I grew up in a family that valued health, and I especially valued health after going through cancer. Yet when it came to how I defined my health value, my definition of health was that to be healthy was to be thin. Again, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. Shout out to Richard Simmons. I hope you are doing well. I still love you, even though, yeah, I don't even know if you promoted weight loss, but I still love you, Richard Simmons, and I hope you're doing well. Okay, to say it another way, the only way for me to be healthy was to lose weight because we are also socialized that you can never be too thin. So weight loss became my goal. And I didn't come up with this on my own. I wasn't, when I was called fat on the bus by Ryan, I'm not going to say his last name. I wasn't like, oh, there's nothing wrong with being fat, right? So again, I didn't come up with this value on my own. It's the water we swim in. So my family talked about health often through a weight loss lens because our families are learning from the medical community and diet culture, and even in natural medicine. And these communities and fields are nesting dolls of patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. As Insatiable guest and feminist marketer Kelly Deal says, it's the water we swim in, and so we are all wet. Exactly. And that's part of this values gap. I think that is our work to do if body discomfort happens to be our thing, is really, really expanding the value of health beyond weight loss and providing so many examples from our own stories of what whole health really looks like. So this health value and it being solely defined by thinness was like a surround sound. So even though it was freaking cancer that made me so thin, not being able to challenge this health value definition deep in my body is a disappointment story because I still believe weight loss was the authoritative answer on health. Again, it would solve everything. And weight loss was achieved through calories in, calories out. That's what everybody says, right? And the more I became disappointed in my body, the more my self-trust deteriorated. From a practitioner's lens, self-authoring means your client is able to be with increasingly nuance and complexity, or complexity fitness, as it's called in developmental psychology. So for example, great eating habits are actually about food and your stories and your physiology and exercise and sunlight and, how connected you feel. It's all these things, right? Rather than just diet and exercise. And so that's an example of complexity fitness. And this is really important to help them develop that complexity fitness because your clients don't need you to tell them what to do. They need to tune into their emerging present needs, which are changing at a faster rate than ever these days. If you've had as many daycare closures as I have, you know what I'm talking about. But to use a food example, originally, I only understood food as calories. That was the only way that I valued it. But then I learned how food was medicine, as I shared above. And then I learned it was about safety, not willpower or discipline. I also now understand it's deeply symbolic, which is such a fun level to work at. In other words, I can understand food means so many things and choose how I want to use it today. That power of choice and knowing that we have other choices changes everything. It's, referred to as agency, but agency is about independent choice. And if we only think our choice is, tying everything back to weight loss, it's like the illusion of choice. But if we are still in our socialized values, we really won't value food beyond calories and tying our efforts back to weight loss, or thinking we have a willpower and discipline problem versus the less simple answer of our stories and how to change those. We aren't able to know what we don't know, in other words, which is why I created a framework because I don't want anyone to spend as much time as I took. Socialized values is where we all start off as adults because we all start out in what is called the socialized mind. This is where we adopt the group norms and accompanying values we grew up around, which for most people is learning about food and exercise and tying that back to weight loss. And this is how humans operate. We are quite shit at challenging our stories unless we make it a conscious process. This is what confirmation bias is about. We actually look for the proof to confirm our stories, not challenge them. So if you think of the Jenga game, and for all of you, if you don't know what Jenga is, look it up. But basically, you have these blocks and you try to remove these little blocks to preserve the tower. And then the person who destabilizes the tower, I think basically loses. So if you think of the Jenga game, your stories are at the bottom layer of the blocks. Okay. So they're the first foundational layers. And then you have all these built up ideas of what is good and bad to do or not to do. That includes what foods are good and bad, what exercise is good and bad, what it means about you if you do these things or not. I'm responsible. I'm lazy. I'm successful. If I'm thin, all of these things just get piled on like a Jenga game. So what we basically do in the Truce coaching is just pull out the bottom layer. Okay. It's more effective and efficient. No need to work through all the layers. We just go for the jugular which is why I say becoming self-authoring is destabilizing and liberating. So many clients are like, who am I? They're getting back more to themselves. And this is why, as my health deteriorated, you would think that my definition of thinness equals health would have cracked. But again, my body story made me think my body was the problem, not what I believed in. And I was in a surround sound of that, right? We fight cancer. We battle heart disease. We try to break our habits, never thinking, wait, what if all of this is telling us something? It was that bottom foundation Jenga legger that I had built so much protective resistance up around, which was how to be good to prevent my body from being a disappointment, and the shame of being bad, which made my body a disappointment. And my weight was included in that, but it wasn't the only thing. And again, all of this was based on real experiences. I got so much more attention after I lost weight from chemo, right? All my clients can echo this. I actually, when I was younger, got more attention, right? Other ones of my clients have been body shamed by healthcare providers, all that kind of stuff. So for us to try to think we can just start over without really relating to this differently is like, it's insane. But again, normal is insane. So again, as a result, I thought my body was the problem, not my goals and approach. And again, this was 20 years ago. So it was hard to find information that challenged this. In some ways, it's actually more tricky today because a lot of people claim that they're challenging this. I see this in the Instagram world, but they're actually recreating like the same problem. That can be another podcast. Yet, as I shared earlier in the podcast, learning to connect food at first to my quick fixes and then being the major medicine to that point and reversing my acne, depression, and IBS expanded my idea of what health was, because I realized some of my weight was inflammatory driven and not calorically driven. If you've ever gained weight after steroids or antibiotics, you probably have experienced this too. And I want to mention this because it's politically incorrect to say today, and yet I'm going to say it because being with what is real is medicine too. While I was in tremendous physical pain during all of this time, the reality is my weight is what motivated me to figure out how my body worked. You can't flip a switch to suddenly not care about your weight loss overnight, especially since we've been groomed since birth to care about it. Often it's vanity and the pain around our weight that gets us started on this challenging self-authoring path, but it won't keep us going. And adding to the nuance was I did lose 15 pounds as a side effect of this food as medicine approach. So food as medicine and calories were now equally central to me in my journey. But as a result, my health value expanded beyond weight loss. It was also now about physical day-to-day health, like not being depressed or up at night in pain with IBS. And I understood how all of this was connected to my health habits and weight loss. Now, the more self-authoring you become, the more you question everything. You become even more fun to be at parties. So if you think you hate small talk now, we laugh about this so much in Truce with Food. So when I couldn't keep eating healthy around scan anxiety season, or when I was stressed, I would emotionally eat. I now knew to question the mainstream answer of discipline and willpower. And I want to note, I was no longer binging or thinking about food much, which again felt like a huge relief at this point. I didn't yet know I could have an even more normal relationship with food. And I really started to work on measuring not if I was a success or failure at being, quote, perfect with my eating, but was I improving upon what I would have done before? So as we start to shift what we value, we start paying attention to different things. And then we learn so much more. So as I shared earlier, becoming self-authoring by reversing my acne, IBS, and depression, plus really understanding how important emotional health, particularly our stories, are as the bedrock of our relationship to ourselves and how we take care of ourselves, we're expanding my idea around health. And this understanding about emotional health deepened in 2011. Right after getting married, I fell into a depression. Carlos had moved to Iowa for his MFA, and I was finishing up grad school at Penn in Philly, but I knew it wasn't from Carlos moving to Iowa. We had a very independent relationship. So I was, I'm a pretty independent person. I'm working on being more interdependent, actually. So this time my eating went the opposite way. I wasn't eating a lot and I didn't want to get out of bed. It was more intense than a functional freeze for my nervous system friends. This was an episodic experience of depression. And I knew our eating habits, especially if it's our thing, are often trying to get us to pay attention to something more deeply. So when I went to an integrated doctor, Dr. Rosenzweig in Old City, Philly, I don't know if he's still there. This was 10 years ago. I went to him at the recommendation of my integrated doctor, Dr. Raquel, about more holistic approaches to being a cancer survivor and what I needed to do to, the nuance of that. And he ended up suggesting visual imagery therapy. And visual imagery therapy is basically, it's part of, I guess would be considered in the healing arts, where you actually have a guided practitioner call images up from your body and you work in metaphor to heal stuff. It's not thought-based at all. And I thought a little talk therapy out at that point. I mean, talk therapy is valuable and has its place, but it just did not feel like the next step for me. And even being open to it was part of my self-authoring journey, because this is another strategic way self-authoring changes you. As you realize what works for your bodies and your ideas of health expand, you will become open to more quote unquote alternative or complementary medicine. I like complementary better. I really like actually integrative medicine, because it's like, okay, this isn't just a sidebar. I'll never forget one Truce with Food client said Truce with Food made her more confident to tell her friends she saw a psychic. Shout out to you, Lori, if you're listening. I love you. But this is what I'm saying. Like, we become more confident embracing that who we really are, and more open to this kind of more kind of, I don't want to say unscientific, but things that are not as concrete, maybe is the word. Yeah, more rooted in energy, which is the frontier of medicine. But, you know, a funny side note is I ended up crying in Dr. Rosenzweig's office, which is why he ended up recommending visual imagery therapy, probably because of how down I was feeling at the time. And I think my body sensed that it was safe. And so I cried, which I was not expecting to do. And as he left the room, I asked him how he survived medical school, because he was so kind and he really believed in the invitation in my depression, like didn't pathologize it. And he said, Allie, that was my near-death experience. I laughed so hard. So he had recommended Bob Schoenholtz, who was my visual imagery therapist, who's been on the podcast. I think his episode is episode 34. It's called Fat is Not a Feeling. It's a really good one. And I did deep work around the grief and emotional losses I had related to cancer. And becoming more self-authoring enabled me to not to see this depression as something to fix or mitigate, but rather I had to sink further in and welcome. Again, relating to it as an important messenger, not something to battle, is the how I continue to evolve my body story. Also, again, complexity fitness here, meaning we can be with nuance and context. This is my story, not trying to say this is everyone's answer for depression. Okay. In fact, my earlier chronic depression was a very different root cause than this, right? It was more physical. And the self-authoring work I did around my own physical healing made me strong enough to be able to be with this depression in a constructive way. So that is not the solution to everyone, right? Everyone's going to have a different path. In Greek mythology, depression was viewed as a visit from the underworld. So I really relied more on this metaphor. And I want to make a note, my privilege in part is what made this possible. Yes, I am so proud of myself for the courage I had to do this healing. And I also had enough safety around me to take this risk. Not only safety, that includes access to the care I needed. So this was a massive turning point for me, as it allowed me to trust my body, and that when eating habits are out of alignment with how I want to feel, whether from eating like too much or not enough, I need to pay attention, not to try to break these habits, but to understand the wisdom in them and what they're pointing me to. Really gets you out of this linear thinking, like, oh, it also rid me of the notion of what is now called toxic positivity these days. In other words, I realized the transformational goal was being with the hard feelings, being with those and working through them rather than trying to think positive. Because again, as part of not wanting my cancer story to define me, I thought I just had to be positive, and I didn't want to be identified as I didn't want to be a victim, right? You hear this all the time in coaching and personal development. Well, not coaching maybe, but personal development. Don't be a victim. But the reality, there's a nuance between being victimized, being a victim, and staying in victimhood, right? But I didn't know that nuance yet. So it was just like, think positive. But after this experience with Bob, I no longer believed in a hierarchy of emotions or the goal to be happy or expected to always be happy. I realized the goal is to be alive and present to what is happening. And that emotional safety isn't everything that goes our way. Rather, we have our own backs, especially given our past when we often had to doubt or abandon ourselves. And I want to note here that I actually gained 10 pounds from not eating enough. And I also wasn't really exercising, but I didn't care about this because this work that I did with Bob felt more important. So another huge turning point of valuing my health more than weight was I wanted to feel whole. I wanted to feel relief. Because we live in a fat phobic culture, we often assume if we are healing deep enough, we will lose weight, or if we are gaining weight, something must be wrong. And that's just not true. Again, this is why complexity fitness, aka being with nuance and context, is so important. And this experience put my body story on a new trajectory. I became in awe of all my body was holding and just waiting for me when I was strong enough to work through it. And visual imagery is when you have images come from your body, like I said. And so this was also a huge initiation into the body speaking through metaphor, and me trusting that our food habits were a metaphor, right? Or symbolic. So my ideas of health really became about food and emotional health, specifically the stories that live in our bodies and how we can work with those stories. and welcoming difficult emotions. And again, this was back in 2012, before Dr. Brene Brown blew up and Glennon Doyle had a podcast called We Can Do Hard Things. So different era, but it's just fun to see again that I could trust my own experience and eventually the research and the data if we're trusting what makes us feel better and feel whole. Again, it doesn't always mean happy, but it means satisfaction. So we can be satisfied in doing hard things like I was with my work with Bob. Then I was pretty smooth sailing health-wise, as far as I can remember. My weight was stable, food and exercise was simple, and I was really fulfilled emotionally. And of course, self-authoring spills out in your life in so many other ways so that you keep taking risks that just increase your capacity over and over again. And that's another podcast. And I really think this increased capacity is so important right now because there's a lot coming at us and we need to be able to know what's ours to do and do it versus just get overwhelmed in how intense it all is. So I guess about 5 years living my life like it's golden, minus Trump's election. And then I wanted to have a baby. And I had gotten pregnant pretty easily and miscarried when I was 37. So it was the summer before Trump got elected. And then I didn't know if I wanted a baby after Trump got elected. So we were trying, but I didn't get pregnant again for about 2 years. And being 39, I did a fertility workup at a hospital here. And I was told I was infertile because I was in early menopause, most likely from the cancer treatments. Again, no one really knew, right? Was it from the cancer treatments? Now I know your fertility numbers can change. I didn't know that at the time. Just like diagnoses that I thought were permanent. Turns out your fertility numbers can be dynamic. I didn't know if I could successfully challenge this diagnosis like all the others I had, especially because my health pillars at this point, my definition of health was your emotional health, being with hard things, food and movement were pretty solid. And I had self-authoring confidence and a radically different body story at this point. So it wasn't that hard to challenge conventional fertility experts who I saw as experts, not authoritative at this point in my life. I also trusted in my body's resilience and ability to heal. I realized that even with cancer treatments and how toxic they are, the body can still make a comeback. But I do want to emphasize, often when you're taking self-authoring risks, you don't know how they're going to come out. You just know that you're willing to take the ride. So obviously challenging this diagnosis worked out by me relying on the expertise of my naturopath and acupuncturist. And what was cool was learning more in detail how important the gut microbiome is in our overall health. My naturopath helped me clear Lyme bacteria. I didn't have Lyme disease, but I had the bacteria that they produce from my gut. And when we got rid of that using homeopathy, which again isn't considered scientific or approved, but hey, it worked for me, my thyroid normalized. And I didn't have to make any dietary changes because my diet was solid, which made me realize sometimes our health involves very simple tweaks, right? And sometimes we build it up. I also took herbs and realized how powerful plant medicine can be. And again, finding two practitioners who believed in me and were philosophically aligned with the body's capability was also critical. Dr. Joy, my naturopath, who I did an episode with, if you're curious more about fertility, but also microbiome and thyroid, and kind of the next level of energy medicine that's beyond functional medicine. She is in the fertility season of episode 9. So that's a really rich conversation. So Dr. Joy and Dr. Bonnie, who Ming Yip is her real name, were like, hey, this is a Tuesday for us. I was like, you really think I can get pregnant? They're like, yeah. So becoming self-authoring will usually have you seek out different practitioners too, who can really believe in your body. However, I will also say, neither of them promised me, right? And that's also to me, I used to want someone to just tell me, yeah, I can guarantee that. You can guarantee 10 pounds in a week. I mean, now it's like fucking insane. Yeah, you can guarantee that, but will it last, right? So this is an example of how self-authoring, I also don't trust people who are like, oh, without a doubt, this is going to work. It's like, I have a good idea, but we have to learn how to tweak and stuff. And also, side note, you can totally get pregnant in menopause. I actually didn't know this because as women, the extent of our first fertility socialization is don't get pregnant and take Motrin for your cramps. So just for all you, I just saw a friend from high school who also didn't know you could get pregnant in menopause and has a 2-year-old now at 45 years old. So just letting you know, kids, the more you know. So this really, again, expanding my idea of what health meant, including understanding how we will all have to train for climate collapse, which is part of why Lyme is everywhere. This also led to me buying a sauna to help with detoxification. I think I've hit peak white woman wellness over here, but that's just for wellness, not for any current post-cancer issues. And then my body story became even more one of awe, especially after getting pregnant on my own and giving birth in a very self-authoring way. Still brings me to my knees to think about what our bodies are capable of. I do want to emphasize that self-authoring doesn't mean everything works out for you. Or if your issue isn't working out, it means you're doing something wrong. There might be more to do. There might not be, right? We just don't know. That's part of the path that you have to go on. So again, self-authoring doesn't mean everything works out for you. It means you probably have more courage to pursue the road less traveled and researched, trust your intuition, and have a richer, more interesting experience at the very least. And I think you have a better chance of often reaching your goals because the more you self-author, the more you learn beyond the narrow definition of the values that we've been socialized in, right? Like, for example, I was socialized to think smart was academic smarts. And now it's like, whoa, our bodies have these wisdom and smarts, right? So it's like I have access to more knowledge, right? My brain and body are bigger in that way. But yeah, it doesn't mean everything's going to work out. So for example, my breast milk didn't come in, most likely from the irradiation, because I had examined every other root cause of why your breast milk couldn't come in, right? Like I even didn't do an epidural in part because I wanted my breast milk to come in, because sometimes that can cause it, right? I mean, when I say I tried everything and prepared the best way I could, I tried everything and it still didn't work out. And it was devastating, right? And then finally, most recently here, being self-authored helped with my horrific insomnia I had that was brought on by early menopause. Let me tell you, it's a special kind of interesting challenge to be a new mother, not sleeping and being in menopause transition. A lot of people say, insomnia is a classic perimenopause symptom, if they even know to recognize perimenopause and menopause symptoms. But being so self-authoring at this point, I'm just like, okay, but do I have to live with this or do I have some agency here? Because most of what I was initially reading didn't address the root causes. So again, being self-authoring, I now value root cause resolution practitioners. So for example, the recommendation is take a melatonin supplement. Okay, well, why am I not producing enough melatonin? Long story short, I hired a sleep coach who told me that, your body needs to be super cold to produce melatonin. We heat up in menopause and perimenopause. So part of getting better sleep was, turning my air conditioner down, right? Again, an easy fix, nothing to do with food. But I found the sleep coach based on another client who had stubborn insomnia herself. But she's a badass self-authoring health rebel. So she kept searching. Shout out to you, Jess, for the recommendation. And working with this sleep coach who was able to navigate the complexities of insomnia, which are part gut, part hormonal, and lifestyle shifts was incredible. So for example, in perimenopause and menopause, you can't push your body like you used to. You are much more sensitive to stress, which can be a really good thing if you take the invitation into that. So you are more stress sensitive. And now I'm pretty emotionally resilient, yet my body needed physical breaks from how nonstop I was going before working with Kelly, my sleep coach. And now my understanding of health has expanded even further to include slowing down and a community of like-minded people and practitioners. And I want to touch upon weight from a self-authoring perspective. Again, this is my self-authoring understanding based on my experience and what I've seen with my clients. Someone else might have a different experience, but because I used to think health was only about weight, it's important to see that my understanding of health and its connection to weight has evolved in nuance and complexity. I see weight in a couple of different ways. Basically, sometimes it might be about our health and sometimes it might not be, right? So we have diet culture, which says you're only healthy based on what you weigh, which I don't believe. And then I think we have this kind of health, again, you can be healthy at every size. And there's this idea that if you ever have, a practitioner tells you that you have to lose weight, that it might be what's called healthism, like, oh, it's really not, your weight isn't really about that. So there's a middle ground, right? And I don't know what it is for each person. You probably might not know for yourself, or maybe you do. But I just wanted to give you my perspective as someone who's worked in this field and had, very personal experiences with this, is that I see it a couple ways. I see weight as a chicken or the egg question when it comes to health. Do we have imbalances that make us gain weight? Or do we gain weight that lead to imbalances, right? Or is our weight what it is and it doesn't matter health-wise? Like in my visual imagery example, I had gained 10 pounds, but I actually got healthier. And I wasn't like at an average weight. I will also, for myself, right? Like I was at an average weight before and kind of an average weight afterwards as well. And too often we tie everything back to weight without getting started on other things that will make us feel better. This happened with some Truce with Food clients this round, right? Thinking they needed to lose weight to start running again, for example. Then they found a trainer who was like, no, here's how you can slowly start back up again, even though you have a knee issue and you've gained some weight, right? So it's like, we always want to tie everything back to our weight, and that keeps us from developing complexity fitness and understanding what else we can do to support ourselves. again, I have more complexity fitness around the whole weight conversation than I did 20 years ago when I began this self-authoring journey. So by self-authoring my health value, I've expanded the inputs beyond diet and exercise to a holistic suite of safety signals that I've discussed here to overcome post-cancer, health issues. And because my body story is no longer one of disappointment, I orient towards expecting the best from it if I'm willing to do the work to address the root causes. And I want to put an asterisk here because as someone who is in it, like on October 1st will be 44 and is definitely feeling, again, just being in menopause, you can't push yourself. You also have to adjust your expectations, right? When I say that your body, expecting the best of my body, it's kind of like with aging, there are some things that change, but I don't think it has to change the way that, mainstream society tells you it has to change, right? Even with menopause, right? It's like, oh, this idea that women should go do Pilates and take it easy now. It's like, no, I'm doing CrossFit and I love it. And it's helping my health a lot. If you're in the menopause, perimenopause camp, I highly recommend following Dr. Stacy Sims and also Selena Yeager, who's a Philly girl at Play Not Pause or Feisty Menopause. Really, really inspiring accounts. And also great research of what is out there about how we don't have to take the mainstream narrative like, oh, go quietly in the night. And, because you don't look the way you used to, you're not a use to society. Fuck that. Okay. Back from my tangent. Roll it back in, Allie. Roll it back in. Okay. I'm getting back my groove. My tangents are back. Okay. So again, this includes trusting and meeting my body where it's at. For example, when I started back at the gym about 18 months ago, I started slow. It wasn't until I was about 6 months in of consistent working out that I could actually push myself at the gym because I was sleeping more regularly and my foot issues had cleared up. And now about a year later, I'm sleeping even better. I'm doing box jumps and I'm lifting weights I never thought I could. This also includes, it shifts the providers I work with, ones who mainly have higher expectations for the body and understand root causes too. And then one final note related to this client question is I often think about in relation to self-authoring and post-cancer issues is what I have prevented versus just resolved. I'll give you one example of, I feel like dozens. So because of my IBS and my mom had colon cancer and of my cancer history, they did a colonoscopy. I had my first colonoscopy when I was like 22. And the doctor was really good looking. It was mortifying. Oh my God, when you're 22 and insecure, that's a whole other podcast. Maybe not a podcast, just like mortifying moment. So I had a colonoscopy in my early 20s. I had one in my late 20s because they had found polyps. And then I had one in my 30s because they had found polyps in all of them. And the most recent one that I had had around like age, I think 34, 35, the GI doctor had removed ones, a couple that could have potentially led to cancer. And I asked her about my diet. And of course she was like, no. But again, I was like, I don't know if she knows, So long story short, I was supposed to get a colonoscopy when I was 38, but because we were moving and because they're unpleasant and because all the things, I just got one last year. I also like to extend follow-up, early screenings because there's risks to the treatments, to the early detections and stuff. But I had a colonoscopy and I was polyp free. And again, I'm eating meat, which supports my blood sugar and supports my gut. Yet you hear with colon cancer, don't eat meat, right? But my colon's healthier now than it was in my 20s and 30s. But my diet and lifestyle supported no polyps. And again, I have dozens examples of this, including how I wonder how non-intervention has helped me and S's health. Maybe in 30 years, I'll read about some of it in a research paper, like seems to be the case with what I thought was wild 20 years ago. Like there is no one diet for everyone, yet my body and clients' experience prove this in real time. And now we have tons of data about that, including the microbiome proof. So now with all of this, my self-authored value of health is now, are you alive? Are you in touch with the aliveness force pulsing through your body and allowing yourself to follow the risks and those callings? And I can handle the complexity that different health habits and modalities at different times will support us and having the capacity and resilience to rise to the challenge of answering the call. So that's how I define health now. And my body story continues to unfold. But there is a sense of deep awe and gratitude for how much it's been with me, carried me, and just been waiting for me to change my relationship to it. So now I'm going to get to some more listener questions. These will be a little bit more faster going because I think we're already like at 40, 45 minutes. But I wanted to answer some listener questions. So what role does diet play in your life as a cancer survivor is the first question. Diet is huge for me, especially because the sense of agency it does give me. Now, I'll never know how much of this agency is perceived or real because we never have 100% control over things, perhaps not even 50%. Who knows? But given the other cancer risks I have, and because I know how much of cancer is environmental, and if I think too long about the environmental threats, I would never not have anxiety or leave my house. It really matters greatly to me to do what I can do to reduce my risk. And my diet plays a huge role in being healthy, not just free of cancer here at 43. Again, the long-term follow-up study I reference says 3/4 or 75% of childhood cancer survivors have a chronic illness from treatment. I know diet has been huge for me in terms of reversing my previous chronic illness and developing issues outside of my cancer and cancer treatments. Again, I'll never know how much because there's so many types of cancers. There's so many types of treatments. There's so many types of genetics. There's lots of complexity and nuance in terms of each cancer survivor experience. I'll also add that while it's huge, the more I've expanded my ideas of health, the more I realize how diet is a smaller part than I originally believed. But it is essential to me. And I think this might be the biggest tragedy of diet culture is that so many people only think of food related to calories and not how it can serve them in their lives. I also think this is a huge gap in intuitive eating that hopefully will be addressed. It's such an opportunity to evolve food from food is only about calories or neutral to medicine too. Because as we can connect how food can make us feel better, we really start eating healthy for ourselves and not the internalized authority forces of, oh, I should be eating this because of X or Y, right? Someone has asked, have you put your cancer in the rearview mirror or does it still occupy your thoughts? The answer is both. At this point, it's mostly in the rearview mirror, especially getting Hodgkin's disease again. However, I know the person that asked this is just a couple years out of their cancer treatments. And in those years more close to our treatments and afterwards, every pain, I wondered if it was cancer. If you're only a few years out from treatment, I think this is pretty normal. And to this day, if something persists in my body longer than I think it should, I can quickly catastrophize. Like when I had plantar fasciitis, I was like, well, is this bone cancer? It's not going away. However, I know my patterns from all the healing I've done. So that gives me the ability to separate my perspective from the current reality of probably not. That space that's come from healing and being self-authoring and opening myself up to health information beyond weight loss. I also understand so much more now how cancer happens. And so I have a stronger sense of confidence in cancer not coming out of nowhere and what I can do to reduce my risk. For example, some of my neighbors are still spraying their yard here in 2022 just to look green. No judgment if you do it, but I just don't understand it. In fact, when we bought our place, I asked, I was like, do you guys spray? Because it's a townhome and they're like, nope. And I'm like, okay, then we can live here. Even with all the information on how Roundup and cancer are connected. So when I'm walking home with Essa from daycare, I'm looking out like a hawk for whose yard has been sprayed. You can smell it too. It's so gross because it gets into the air and water. But he's in this point where he just wants to run on everyone's yard and just lay on it. And so I have to look for like, is that sign here, you know? And it feels frankly pretty defeating because when it's sprayed, like I said, it's getting in the air and water. And it feels like this massive thing that the only thing I can do is join with others to like work on this. And people are doing that, right? And sometimes it feels futile of like just trying to reduce our individual exposures. But his body is so small and this stuff is just so horrific for kids' bodies. I mean, that's part of what gave me cancer was being exposed to the Roundup on my friend's yard when we were playing gymnastics and then getting a horrible rash, for 2 weeks and doctors not knowing what it caused it. So I didn't get proper detoxification. That's also when my weight started to increase. Right now, I know my initial weight gain was not about willpower or discipline or loving food. It was, I was inflamed. So because of how much I know, cancer is something I'm frequently trying to prevent, what I can control, and also holding the reality that a lot of what drives cancer, how our food and yards is doused in glyphosate, air pollution from the petrochemical industry, PFAS, right? The forever chemicals we're hearing more and more about. It's mostly out of my control, right? Even if I'm working on collective efforts, that's to benefit Essa and Essa's children, if humanity makes it, right? So I see a lot of things as a cancer threat or wonder if they will be found to be a cancer threat. So that's the answer related to the cancer itself occupying my thoughts. And then there are the health challenges that bring back the emotional pain, like my infertility diagnosis. That ended up being triumphant, but in the beginning, there was a lot of grief, right? And it took me almost a year of finding out I was pregnant from that infertility diagnosis. So, that's a lot of sadness and wondering and grappling with, I've done everything I can and it still might not matter for what I want next. And then post-birth, my breast milk not coming in, most likely from the radiation all those years ago, or being in early menopause while being a new mom. That was a hormonal nightmare and made the first 2 years of Essa's life very, very difficult. And most likely not having a choice in a second biological child, which is pretty big. But just like I had to learn not to tie everything back to weight, I try not to tie everything back to cancer. For example, I know other people who have never had cancer struggle with infertility, or others who are in early menopause just because they're finding people who have had COVID does that to some people, puts them in early menopause. So this is important because when we feel like it's our body that's the problem, that adds we often feel targeted by life, and that adds another layer of unnecessary pain and shame that isn't necessary to the very real pain we need to work through. But I also have to honor the grief because grief doesn't go away. It was really devastating to me and really made the first week, my breast milk not coming in. For some people, that might not have been a big deal, but given how important I feel breast milk is to immunity and how much I value health, right, beyond weight loss now, is really devastating to me and really made the first weeks of Essa's life so difficult because I tried everything and it just didn't work out the way I wanted it to. So those are a few ways that I'm in relationship with my cancer today. Some people asked about residual worries and things you have to be concerned about that others don't. So I'm going to speak for myself here because the first thing that came to mind was how much I know about cancer and healthcare in general that most people don't, or it doesn't feel enough of a risk that they do anything about. I remember one of my best friends came to see me right after Essa was born. Hey, Kelly, if you're listening. I don't think she listens to my podcast, but Kelly is a very smart cookie, Harvard MBA here for her. And I was telling her about my birth and like all the different like non-traditional decisions I made. And she's like, wow, you really thought a lot about this. And I'm like, I can't believe so many people don't, right? So this comes back to the hard and freeing reality that our healthcare providers are experts, but not authorities. Medicine is a practice. US medicine, again, saved my life. And its very structure and how it operates has been organized around capitalism. This dictates what gets studied, what questions get pursued, what treatments are on the table to review. So if anyone's interested in a deep dive of this like twisted reality, highly recommend Secret History of the War on Cancer by Dr. Deborah Davis. Show you how doctors used to recommend smoking. Also want to mention, and they knew that it was bad for people. I don't know if it's quite as evil today. I think it's just the forces of patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism that come together, right? Just like removing Trump from office does not fix all of our problems. He's like the symptom of these forces. The state of any one person giving you specific advice, it's not them. It's like the system and the forces that have gone into their education or view of the world. Also, I want to mention, I don't think doctors, hospitals, government officials are all that bad either. That's why I just went on that tangent. It's too simple to say anything is all good or all bad. And it's again, the ability to be with nuance and complexity. And I saw a lot of binary action going on with COVID. So I feel there's this need to say it's too simplistic to point one finger at these places without looking at the more complicated forces that have influenced them. So while there's a lot we do know, there's a lot we don't know. And I also recognize I'm a 5 on the Enneagram, which means I feel safe when I know. Many people do not. There's not a right or wrong. It's just, this is how I'm oriented. So there's the mental piece of managing this, and it translates into a lot of choices. Like I won't go through those radiation machines at the airport. I know they say, oh, exposure is insignificant. Well, yeah, if that's the only exposure you ever get. And I know I'm getting more radiation exposure in the airplane. Like I'm not like, oh, come on. And did you really study those machines all that well, given their real purpose is to make money off the quote, war on terror? I mean, all these things, capitalism just drives a real clusterfuck of what ends up becoming normal in our culture. And the other big piece is navigating the complexities and health choices that come with such harsh treatments. One tiny example is, like I said, I'm at an increased risk of breast cancer from my radiation treatments. And yet a lot of studies show that mammogram radiation increases the risk in high risk patients, right? There's the nuance. Hence part of why my oncologist had me getting MRIs all those years. And part of it is also the density of your breast tissue when you're younger. Anyhow, I remember when some of this analysis came out, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was a news headline. You got to read beyond the headline, people. I'm not always great at doing that, but it basically said, not everyone should be getting mammograms. And people were enraged at these recommendations to not have mammograms. But if you look at the data, it's true. And so again, this is why knowing your body and personal risk is so important. Again, I'm not saying mammograms are bad. I'm just saying everyone has different risks. And for me, being a high risk person, it's not the best. Okay. I feel like I need to repeat this because we're just in a very like polarized place. And it's also, self-authoring 40% of people will get to self-authoring and 60% of people will never get there. They'll stay in the socialized mind, which is a more binary mindset. It's not about how smart you are. It's about, are you willing to learn how to learn? Are you willing to look at your own shit and reactions and challenge that? Is basically the TLDR of how you become self-authoring. So it's not about how smart or being better than or elitist. It's just, I want to be just clear that I'm not saying mammograms are bad. I'm saying you have to know your risk and your personal risk. And I've been forced to really rumble with this, right? And I'm really, frankly, fucking grateful that I can be with all of this. It's because it's a zoo out here in terms of health information and recommendations and how the political climate informs scientific policy and public health. And I'll say it's on both sides that it's crazy, okay? Meaning both political parties. So yeah. But ultimately, the question is, where's the balance? It will be different for each person. And I'm not sure we can ever have 100% confidence in our risk perception. And even with the MRIs I do, I've spaced them out more than is recommended because I've been suspect of the MRI dye. I remember calling up in Philly was where I lived when I was getting all these MRIs. And I was like, I called the woman. I'm like, what is in that dye that you use? And she's like, it's gadolinium. It comes from the earth. And I'm like, radon comes from the earth. It doesn't mean I want it in my body. And wouldn't you know it, it's now coming under scrutiny. It can be highly toxic in certain people. And again, because I had Hodgkin's disease, which is an immune cancer, trouble that comes from trouble of detoxifying, this is something I have to be concerned about. And the other physical thing aside from cancer is potential heart issues from treatments. We're still learning about the full risks. And some people do have heart issues from radiation, especially. And this comes up with something like COVID and the COVID vaccine. And can't believe I'm even going to poke the bear on the vaccines in this podcast. But, in the beginning, I actually had COVID before the vaccines were even on the table, right? So I got COVID. It was pretty mild for all of us. We actually all got it. Thank God, because it's a wild virus and you don't know how it's going to perform. And we're on the beginning of a dramatic learning curve of a major disease, right? And you learn so much. I mean, think about what we know now compared to what we knew in 2020, right? So we now know COVID is a vascular disease with regard to the serious complications and causes of mortality. So the COVID vaccine does have known risks, specifically some heart risks, and it's a new technology, right? And I heard on Dr. Aviva's Ram podcast, her sharing how doctors usually won't take a new medication for 3 years themselves because they want to see what side effects pop up from new drugs. Now, she did say most physicians she knew were taking the COVID vaccine. But again, I don't know if physicians know how to be healthy. They know how to treat disease, but these are two separate things. So for a lot of people, it was really clear that they were going to, and most people in my circles were like, I'm getting the vaccine, I'm getting the vaccine. But we knew that, if you had COVID, you had to wait 90 days, right? So it's like, I had just had COVID. And so because your immune response is so high. So anyways, layering on the Hodgkin's disease, the cancer I had is from an overactive immune system. I have natural immunity. And again, we don't know how long natural immunity lasts, right? Who knows? We're still at the beginning of a learning curve. And I have heart risks that I don't even fully know yet, that doctors don't even fully know. So what do you do, right? Especially when there were mandates for a while, right? So I have to stay current on a lot of research, digging below media headlines, right? Like, I read in Stat Magazine, which is a highly scientific journal, that the vaccine was never proven to prevent transmission. But in my circles, which people were like, oh, you got to do it for grandma, right? But it hadn't been proven. And now we know that it had never been proven. So really digging below the headlines. And then also, I'm pretty good at being independent, but it's like, it's hard when everyone that you love and care about has a viewpoint, right? It's like, again, confirmation bias. And I think the vaccine makes sense for tons of people. I'm not pro or against vaccines. I'm for pro-vaccine discernment, which I can only say for myself. Probably shouldn't include this in the podcast because whatever, but here's to my wild self. This is what wanted to unfold. So in essence, I invest a lot more time and energy. In some ways, I wish I had to make health decisions because I can really be with how the scientific process works, that it unfolds, and that as a childhood cancer survivor, right? I mean, things are getting better, but we're still at the very beginning of a learning curve, right? And I hope that I can contribute, especially, answering these surveys so that the people who come after me, okay, we know to look at their guts and their hormonal health. We know to focus on the trauma of all of this, right? I hope that is what's happening. And I do know that I have some friends who unfortunately are going through cancer now. Now they're in New York, but they have more, access to integrative care. A lot of people get talked to nutritionists now. I don't know if the nutritionists are telling them the right things, but right? The needle is moving. So there's progress in that way, but it still requires just a lot of research and bringing a lot of context. Okay. So I think this is the last question. Yeah. How can friends be supportive? I love that this was asked. Number one, do not say everything happens for a reason. Other people say that to feel better for themselves. Like there is an order to this unless they aren't at risk. It's just not true. Okay. In my opinion. So not saying everything happens for a reason is just, is huge. Number two, offer to come to a treatment with someone. Now, I know COVID may have changed this, but often this is part of someone's world is so isolating, even though it takes over your life. Coming into that world with someone is hard because so many people don't want to be in that world or keep checking in on them or their caretakers. Send them cards and presents. It feels good to know people are in your corner. If people have kids, offer to watch the kids while they recover from treatments. It's a special kind of hell on earth to have to watch your kids when you are sick yourself. Ask me how I know. Part of that low immunity that I was struggling with. Cook meals that they love. I can't underestimate the power of being held like this. Number three, don't give people health or natural medicine advice unless they ask. I believe whatever path you think has the best chance of working is what has the best chance of working. And if someone is interested in complementary medicine or alternative, support them because many people around them won't, often including their doctors. Number four, be comfortable with someone's discomfort by learning to be comfortable with your own. It can be really hard to find people who won't try to put a positive spin on a cancer experience, asking someone, where are you now in the cancer experience? And practice just listening. Not trying to fix can be soothing for that person. That's mostly what comes to mind. I also think if you know a parent whose child is going through this, helping them with their siblings or whatever goes a long way. In our culture, we tend to lean away from people who need the most support because of our own discomfort with how messy cancer is. But be the person who learns to be in the mess. All right, I am going to wrap up here. The transcripts are always available at alishapiro.com/podcast. Just some key takeaways, because that was a lot. Expert versus authority and growing into an authoritative force so you can self-advocate for your body. And I say authoritative first because we're never going to be all-knowing. That's part of dancing with the mystery, which I think of as God. And I think we find that in our bodies, which is kind of what I alluded to at the top of the hour. I was like, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But we want to be an authoritative force and remain humble because you're always going to learn more. That's the one thing too. I forgot to mention self-authoring, just becoming self-authoring. How it's helped me is realizing I don't know what I don't know. And every time I come out of a health challenge, I'm going to learn more, but I don't know the steps. I don't know the plan yet. I just have to keep trusting my body to feel better and better. Number two, learning to relate to our stories and thus ourselves differently so we can repair the self-trust in ourselves by entertaining the idea that your eating habits make complete sense, that your bad eating habits make complete sense. This includes really understanding food is about safety and getting curious about what is at risk when you don't eat or do the things you know you should do to feel better. And really learning to expand your ideas of food beyond calories or even medicine so you can more fully heal. This also means understanding food is important and it's not the only thing that matters. And it's okay if your desire to lose weight doesn't go away overnight. Being able to hold the and that matters to you and learning how your body works and sending the physical and emotional safety signals it needs for you to feel as great as possible in your body is the key to transforming your eating habits, consistency, and getting to a weight that is healthy for you. I'm not sure anyone really knows what that is. Your body will guide you. And self-authoring is the bomb. I shouldn't use a war metaphor, but it is more work up front, and it guarantees you'll continue to learn how to support your body, health, and create a life on your terms for all the courage and self-trust you reclaim.